My name's Anne Proctor, a director of the board of VisAsia, and it's my great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of VisAsia. VisAsia is a philanthropic entity under the umbrella of the Art Gallery of New South Wales that aims to promote education and research into Asian art and culture. And for over 20 years, we've collaborated with researchers and academics and scholars and curators in this field. VisAsia is very pleased to continue a partnership with the Power Institute and the China Studies Centre of Sydney University in collaborating in this 2020 series of excellent and thought-provoking lectures on art and technology. And I'm particularly looking forward to today's presentation by Yu-chih Lai, who will be introduced by Olivia Krischer from the China Studies Centre. Thank you, Olivia. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Anne. It's great. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. My name is Olivia Krischer. I am the acting director at the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. And we're delighted to be able to present the series again this year with our partners, as you've just heard from VisAsia, as well as the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and of course the Power Institute. Welcome to what is the third in this year's series under the theme of art and technology. Our first two lectures by Lisa Claypool from the University of Alberta, as well as our second lecture, Rahab Alana, by Rahab Alana from Al-Kazi Foundation for the Arts, are actually now online. So if you missed those, I'd encourage you to check the Power Publications website, where you'll find the full series. On the 23rd of November, just before I introduce our speaker today, I'll mention that curator Yung Ma, who's the artistic director of the Seoul Media City Biennale this coming year, will conclude the lecture series with a talk on moving image works from Hong Kong. And I'm also delighted to announce that Rahab Alana will be back for a panel discussion entitled Revisioning the Present, which he will moderate in conversation with three practitioners from across South Asia on the 26th of November, and we should be circulating details for that shortly. So while we're moving around times and geographies, the series theme, art and technology, has sought to invite perspectives on how technology has affected or fashioned visual art practice in and across Asia, and how art has in turn represented and embodied such technology. Our discussion today in particular takes us way back over 100 years ago, yet to consider what I think are ever-present issues of artistic reproduction, and particularly the impact that this has had on the reception of art and our understanding of art and its history. In this case, it's the reception of traditional Chinese art, or in late 19th century Shanghai, as well as other forms, and we will, I'm sure, be coming to question what words such as traditional mean after today's lecture. And this is particularly in the case of, as you'll hear in a moment, new technology of copperplate printing in 1880s Shanghai. It gives me therefore great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lai Yu-chih, a researcher from the Institute of Modern History at Academia Sinica in Taipei. Dr. Lai received her PhD originally in the history of art from Yale University, and in addition to her scholarly work, she's also had a career as a curator at the National Palace Collection in Taipei. In her research, she's developed two specialty areas, including the visual culture of 19th century Shanghai, which we'll be hearing about today, and particularly its interactions with Japan, as well as the globalized visual and material culture of the Manchu court in Qing Dynasty 18th century. And this is actually the subject, or at least it informs her next book project, which is tentatively titled Visual Governance, Art, Knowledge and Politics in the Qing Court. Her recent publications include the co-authored catalogue Fineries of Forgery, Suzhou Fakes and Their Influence in the 16th and 18th Century, from 2018 for the exhibition by that name, which she co-curated with Li Jianglin and Shi Huaqiu. And there's also a forthcoming publication on the subject of seeing and touching gender, new perspectives in modern Chinese art, which Dr. Lai co-edited with Dorothy Goh and Ida Yuan Wong. So I'm sure you will appreciate that she has expertise and knowledge that's spanning many centuries. So we're very fortunate to have her here today. Finally, on a personal note, China-Japan relations through art in the modern period has been a subject of my own research fascination. And I was very fortunate to spend some time as a visiting scholar, actually at the Institute of Modern History at Academia Sinica, where I first met Dr. Lai in person, although I was familiar with her work before. And I also got to spend time with some of her distinguished colleagues. So I'm particularly happy to be able to invite her into the Sydney Asian Art Series this year and to learn more from her very rich research. Before we do get underway, there's a little bit of housekeeping. Please do post your questions in the Q&A window at any time during the webinar, and I'll be able to moderate the discussion afterwards from around 1:45 or 1:50 Sydney time. So we should have a good period of time to discuss afterwards. So please do post your questions at any time. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Lai Yu-chih. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, for the generous introduction. And it's really my honor to be part of this Sydney Asian Art Series lectures, especially the topic this year, the theme of the series this year, art and technology. I think is more than appropriate. For our situation globally, now, to see how the technology, or what and how the technology could be factored into the way of our life and the way we see art. And so and I also would like to extend my thanks and gratitude to the invitation of the Powell Institute and University of Sydney China Study Centers. And so my talk today, let me share my screen. Okay. My talk today entitled Mediated Tradition, Japanese Copperplate Printing and Art Reproduction in 1880s Shanghai. It's exactly the topic I was talking about, how the technology factor into the way we perceive art and also the way we conducted our production and so on. So as the well-known fact, the late 19th century, marked by China's opening of Treaty Port as a direct consequence of the Opium War in 1842, and Japan's termination of its national isolation policy in 1858, had become the most radical period of integrated globalization. Shanghai, as one of the 4 treaty ports, gradually emerged not only as one of the most cosmopolitan and commercially vibrant cities in 19th century, but also as the epicenter of Sino-Japanese and also Sino-Western exchanges of all kinds, from commercial, intellectual to new media, technological, artistic, and extra. So you can see here is the famous, on the right is the famous scene in Shanghai. You can see the Indian policeman. Let me have the pointer. Okay. You can see the Indian policeman, Western couples, bicycle riding, and extra. And the one on the left is the new kind of sensation of the opening of the port in Japan. This trend of globalization had changed the practice of making, circulation, learning, and marketing art in the traditional Chinese art world. We may say with each passing day, technology, especially the technology for imagery reproduction, experienced significant transformation during this period. Scholars have long noticed how the, quote, art of mechanical reproduction, unquote, emerged after the invention of lithography. as cast by Walter Benjamin, and which had revolutionary impacts on the practice of art and its consumption in late-Qing China. I mean, in terms of the method or the detail, I mean, how to make lithography, I will just won't go into all these details. You can see here. And this is the Dianshizai factory, actually. I mean, shown in Wu You's depiction of the famous scene in Shanghai. So you can see this is really making lithography printing become a kind of sensational new, I mean, tourist spot, even in Shanghai in the 1880s. However, very few scholars have paid attention to another form of mechanical reproduction, copperplate printing. This is the copperplate printing manual published in 1880s in Shanghai, which was introduced to Shanghai commercially almost at the same time as the lithography. Significantly, while the introduction of lithography centered on the Englishman Ernest Major, who is the owner of the famous Shanghai newspaper Shenbao, and also this Dianshizai lithography studio, the imports of copperplate printing technology move along the lines that web the old Sino-Japanese network, tracing back to the Edo period. One of the most representative firm in this regard was Rakuzendō, run by this famous journalist, entrepreneur, and adventurer Kishida Ginkō. Like Ernest Major, Kishida was very keen on reproducing so-called new technology to reproduce traditional Chinese art. Both claim to be Chinese art lover, and both publish a kind of painting manual based on their so-called personal collection. Of course, one was by the means of lithography. On your left, Dianshizai assorted painting. There are two editions, one published in 1881, the other published in 1886, and the other one by copperplate engraving. On your right is Yinxiangge assorted painting, published in 1885. The two publications share a similar title, format, size, and editing style. So today's talk will take the copperplate printing business of Rakuzendō as its focus to examine how it competed with the lithography in the publishing industry. Most importantly, it will explore how the image of Chinese art mediated by lithography differed from that of copperplate printing, and how these two media from the West, that is lithography, and Japan, that is copperplate printing, respectively, were perceived and accepted at the time, and contributing to a silent mutation in the Chinese art of the late 19th century. So the one on the right is the image from the Dianshizai assorted painting, so was printed in lithography. The one on your left is the image from the Kishida Ginkō's Yinxiangge assorted painting printed by copperplate printing. The introduction of copperplate printing in Shanghai. Copperplate printing in the late-Qing period referred to the techniques of engraving mainly use the etching with acid. So you can see this manual actually tell you how to use acid to kind of etching the copperplate. This technique has been quite well advanced and was popular in Europe from as early as the Renaissance period. It had been introduced to the Qing court by the Jesuits sometime around the late 17th century, and had become a kind of established as a kind of official art genre in the court painting workshop no later than the 18th century. For example, this is the Chinese, this is the Qianlong's Beetle prints that he commissioned in France. And this is the one that emulated the same format and style and made locally in the Qing court. However, this technique seemed to have been unknown outside the immediate confine of the court, and was introduced to Shanghai again through Japanese connection in the late-Qing period. It was explained clearly in these notes on the copperplate engraving written by Wang Zhaohong in 1889. So how Kishida Ginkō come into this business of copperplate printing? Kishida Ginkō was a businessman with extraordinary sharp wit and an eye on trend-setting innovation. He visited Shanghai as early as 1866 to assist the American physician, translator, and missionary James Curtis Herman to print his Japanese and English dictionary. You can see here. In return for his assistance in editing and printing this dictionary, Dr. Herman gave him the formula for an eye drop medication called Seikise. You can see the medicine here, which laid the foundation for establishing his own pharmacy called Rakuzendō in Tokyo in 1877, which was very, very successful. Meanwhile, he worked as the chief editor and journalist for Tokyo Nijimi Shimbun. So this is also very beginning of modern journalism in Japan and also in China too. And so he worked as the chief editor for this newspaper, Tokyo Nijimi Shimbun, from 1873 to 1877. He was not only one of the first war correspondents in Japan who went to Taiwan to report the Japanese expedition to Taiwan in 1874, first hand. Here, the image on your right is the prints, the free prints comes with the newspaper of the Tokyo Nijimi Shimbun, illustrating that Kishida Ginkō here, on his trip as a reporter to Taiwan. And so you can see in this print, who was carried because of the war situation, he was carried by a local Taiwanese. He was not only the first war correspondent, he also was one of the first accompanied reporters to report on site on Emperor Meiji's imperial tours. He founded Rakuzendō's Shanghai branch in 1878, but he first only ran it as a kind of pharmacy and did not go into this book business until very late, until early 1880s. The reason why Ginkō decided to march headfirst into this book trading business undoubtedly has much to do with this emerging wave of importing Japanese books in Shanghai in the 1880s. This is the newspaper advertisements, commercial advertisements, in Shenbao. You can see it's all about advertising Japanese books in Shanghai. So there's a kind of wave of importing great quantity of Japanese books, to Shanghai in the 80s, which Ginkō actually observed personally. But how could Ginkō compete with all these other importers that you can see in the newspaper? In addition to importing Chinese books in all Japanese collection and Japanese printed Chinese texts in the Edo period, Ginkō actually also imported Japanese old wood blocks of the Edo period, cut off their Japanese punctuation marks that content, and left only the Chinese text to have them reprinted in Shanghai. So you can see in this wave of importation of Japanese book, actually it's not importing Japanese books, actually it's importing Chinese book in the Japanese collection, all the Chinese book printed in Japan. So what the Shanghai market wants actually is the Chinese book instead of Japanese book. More significantly, he imported copperplate books. However, Ginkō was actually not the only one or the first one to introduce copperplate printing and books to Shanghai. The publisher of Shenbao, the famous newspaper I just mentioned, run by Ernest Major, actually imported copperplate engraved map from Japan at least as early as October in 1877, which is earlier than the establishment of Rakuzendō in Shanghai branch in 1878. The sharp and refined line that characterize one of the most important aspects of the copperplate printing made it especially suitable for printing map with intricate details. Here you can see this is other map, printed by Rakuzendō. Using copperplate engraving. So you can see this very, very intricate line and details. Ginkō's Rakuzendō not only imported, but also published many of them. One of the most famous one is the 3-volume of Map of Qing China, published in 1882. Among all the business initiatives, the most innovative and successful one was to take advantage of this refined characteristic of copperplate printing to publish this kind of miniaturized book for imperial exams, which really make him a fortune. You see, this actually is the one of the miniature, the kind of very, very tiny books that published by Ginkō's publisher, and now is in the College of France collection. According to Ikeda Momokawa, in his book, The 100 Episodes of Shanghai, publishing in 1920s, it mentioned that these miniaturized exam books, because of their small size, are extremely convenient for carrying secretly to the examination place for the sake of cheating. Much in demand, as many as 150,000 copies were sold each year, so it's really a great amount. Momokawa pointed out the decline of miniaturized copperplate printed books was a result of the coming of miniaturized lithographic books. It is important to note that the business pattern Momokawa mentioned, which usually involve making the copperplates in Tokyo, shipping them to Shanghai, and hire the local workers to execute the printing. So it's really a kind of global labor division. A report publishing in Yomi Uri Shimbun, you can see here in 1887, briefing the Shanghai's business world, delineated a kind of comprehensive picture of this matter. It says that it is well known that the core business of the owner of Rakuzendō is selling medicines and books to people of the Qing. The copperplate miniature books that have been in vogue everywhere in Qing China recently did not exist there before. It started from the fact that Kishida Ginkō reprinting books such as Jin Ziqian and also Kun Xue Jiwen. You can see this book on the top, and so on, which was the origin of miniaturized copperplate books in Qing China. Later, Rakuzendō published and sold dozen kinds of books for the use of taking the exams. It happened to be the time when Qing people began to feel the convenience of copperplate book. In particular, copperplate printed books centered to the preference of Qing people, so sales were great and profit enormous. However, as proverbs goes, quote, people go to the places where their interests lie, unquote. And more people joined this trade as copperplate covers and salespeople become numerous. However, now the workers who can master the technique of copperplate engraving are still restricted to the Japanese. Qing people who wanted to invest in this trade all recruited copperplate covers engravers from Japan. For example, in this arriving boat are dozens of workers led by professional copperplate engraver named Ando. People like them all came to be hired by Qing people. It is said that dozens more workers from all countries are coming. Because of that, business of Rakuzendō has suffered much recently. The business of printing miniature copperplate books was pioneered by Kishida Ginkō, but given the huge profit it generated, many people rushed to join and compete in this market. Since the techniques of engraving copperplates are still controlled by the Japanese. So what Ginkō did was to commission the plates in Tokyo, ship them to Shanghai, print and bind the final product using local Shanghai workers. In contrast to his working patterns, some Chinese businessmen even recruited Japanese workers directly to work in Shanghai. In this situation, the advantage of Rakuzendō was quite limited. Therefore, when Ginkō died in 1905, after settling his property, it was found that there was a loss of as much as 60,000 kin. The business of miniature copperplate books was no longer a cash cow. The showdown between 影响格 assorted painting versus 电时代 assorted painting. The business predicament that Ginkō's Rakuzendō faced was not restricted to the outside factors, such as the imitation of these business models by competitors and even more aggressive operation by transporting Japanese workers directly to Shanghai, but also the internal factors regarding the nature of the technology itself, and especially its localization, which actually play an even more crucial role in deciding the fate of Ginkō's copperplate printing business. As pointed out by Momokawa earlier, the setback of Rakuzendō in the business of miniaturized copperplate books, for example, mainly resulted from the competition with lithographic books because of their better price. When Rakuzendō lost his advantage in producing miniature examination books, how could it turn around the situation? Ginkō was very interested in the business of image reproduction. In addition to noticing Major's profitable business in art reproduction, even at the very early stage of Major's effort, you can see here, this is the 电时代 printing studio, mainly. So when Ernest Major establishes his Shenbao business, he also established 电时代 printing studio, mainly for reproducing images and paintings, calligraphies, and so on. So that was very profitable. So in addition to noticing Major's profitable business in art reproduction, even at very early stage of Major's effort, Ginkō was an ardent art collector and enthusiastically associated with the art circle in Shanghai. Ginkō published the miniature printing manual, 点时在 Ginkō published his miniature printing manual, 影响格重画. You can see here in 1885. 影响格 assorted painting share the similar, as I said earlier, share the similar title, format, size, and editing style with the 电时代 assorted painting of 1881. The one on the right is the one, as I mentioned earlier, by Kishida Ginkō in copperplate printing. The one on the left is the one by Ernest Major using lithography. So you can see their title page are very similar and the size are very similar. Judging from their formal similarity and also the fact that both printing painting manual claim to be based on the art collection of their owners, that is Ernest Major on the left and Kishida Ginkō on the right. The publication of 影响格 assorted painting apparently was meant to emulate Ernest Major's 电时代 assorted painting manual of 1881 on your left. Ginkō even hired the same calligrapher, you can see here, the same calligrapher, to write the title page of each gen for his own 影响格 assorted painting. Probably intimidated by such a close follower and also aggressive imitation of other lithographic publisher, Major, after published in 1881, Major immediately reissued the second edition, the 点实在 assorted painting, in the last month of the very same year, that is 11 year of the Guangxu reign, that is January of 1886. So the second edition of 点实在 painting manual actually only published only several months later. I mean, the Kishida Ginkō's in-Shanghai assorted painting manual. So this is represent 点实在 strive to regain his leading position in the art reproduction business. As discussed in my previous article on the 点实在 assorted painting, the innovation of 点实在 studio to reproduce contemporary Shanghai painters' drawing directly and to distribute them as the free insert with 点实在 pictorial was not only create a sensation in Shanghai, but most importantly, offer a kind of perfect solution to reproduce artist's hand in the traditional industry of making painting manual. So the difference between the first edition of 点实在 assorted painting manual and also the second edition is that Major tried to include a lot of new images that used to be the insert of this 点实在 pictorial magazine. So this is really also a kind of new marketing strategy that if you buy this 点实在 pictorial magazine, you will have this kind of free inserts here. You can see that is the insert that you can tear off, become a painting. That is done by, the contemporary Shanghai, famous contemporary Shanghai painters, and then using lithography. So you can see, so the quality of the printing is totally different from the woodblock print. You can see this kind of very soft line. Very real, almost like the original brush movement of the brush stroke, which is very different from this kind of old style woodblock printed painting manual that has been meditated by the woodblock cover. You can see this kind of stiff of the line. That is not the choices of the brush or not the choices of the artist's hand, but the choices of the knife. And this is really the new kind of sensation that the artist's hand can be really transparently produced on printed publication. For example, like this one, this is another free inserts comes with the 点实在 pictorial magazine. If you don't see clearly, you probably will mistaken it as a real painting because this is printed by lithography, but hand colored. So it's almost like a real painting. So in the age of woodblock printing, the image of artwork will transfer to woodblocks by carving and will inevitably distorted due to the differences in tool, artist's brush versus the carver's knife, and the non-transferability of these two different media, writing on paper and seal versus carving on woodblock. At the beginning of lithography, so this is really a totally new age that the choices of hand could be reproduced, and then people can buy almost like a real painting, at a very affordable price. But at the beginning of the lithography printing, the problem actually was not solved immediately. Despite of the fact that photolithography could reproduce image directly and completely, however, if what it reproduced is still the old woodblock printed painting manual with the image distorted by carver, the gap between printed image and original artwork still was insurmountable. For example, this is the one in the first. This is the one in the first. The one on the right is the one from the first edition of 点实在 assorted painting. The image was taken directly from a Japanese painting manual using woodblock print. So when you have the photolithography, you have this new technology, but if you use just to reproduce the all woodblock printed image, the effect is almost the same. So in other words, so in the first edition, I mean, Ernest Major or the 电时代 studio haven't fully realized the potential of lithography in the image of our reproduction. They're still using the photolithography as a kind of new means to reproduce the all woodblock printed image. Only until the one I just show you here, that later in the second edition, that he realized the fully potential of this new technology. So this would be the first time in Chinese history that commoner had free drawing from artist's hand directly at an affordable price. This innovation revolutionized learning and artistic practice in the traditional Chinese art world. Artists no longer has to learn from distorted image and imagine the original masterpieces from woodblock printed painting manual, but could vividly observe and even trace the movement of the master's hand like this one, almost firsthand. The brilliant idea of Major's, this brilliant idea of Major's soon had been copied. This is the one, a painting manual by contemporary Shanghai artists entitled Drawing of the Famous Artists in Shanghai. Was published lithographically in November 1885 by a Shanghai bookstore, which is not 电时代. So this is really a new idea. So a lot of people see the potential here. This painting manual was such a great success that the original publisher even warned the reader against pirating copies of these books in Shenbao. 典时代 was the first one to come up with this idea and practice. Must have felt the pressure. It published the second edition of 电时代 assorted painting 2 months later. This is the second edition of 电时代 assorted painting. This time, Major included a lot of these kind of free inserts that really innovated the whole business of our reproduction that in Shanghai. I mean, he did for the 电时代 pictorial magazine. So he included a lot of these previously published free insert to his painting manuals. It was not surprising that 电时代 this time incorporated free inserts, as I said earlier, that reproduced vividly the first-hand the drawing by the contemporary Shanghai artists through the technology of photolithography. When Major reissued the 电时代 assorted painting in 1886. The strategy of editing and reissuing the second edition of the 电时代 assorted painting was quite complicated. In addition to aggressive lithographic peer, Ginkō's close following by copy contents, format, and even business model with another printing technology might also be another factors. What is the result of this final showdown from the summer of 1885 to early 1886 in this battle of image reproduction? In the case of 影像阁 assorted painting and 电时代 assorted painting, there is no direct evidence in terms of sales numbers. However, undoubtedly, the second edition of 电时代 assorted painting was probably the most common painting manual, the most surviving in terms of copy in libraries around the world, and the most reproduced in different format and edition, even up until present day. In contrast, it is very difficult to find traces of 影像阁 assorted painting on your right, which only survive in very limited copies. One reason why 影像阁 assorted painting was not as well received and must have been in higher price must have been its higher price. An even more crucial factor was the incapability of the nature of copperplate engraving and the expected use of context for Chinese painting manual in the traditional Chinese art world. There are 6 volumes in Yinxiange assorted painting, which contain the preface in the first volume by Wang Dao, the famous journalist, the new style intellect and cultural celebrity in Shanghai, and Shen Dunhe, an elite from the westernization group, the so-called Yang Wu Pai, who has studied at Cambridge University and majored in political and politics and law. Of note here is that in contrast to the free writing effect that this kind of free writing effect that 电视在 painting manual strive to achieve, Yinxiange assorted painting show meticulous details that challenge or means to go beyond the human capacity of hand treatment. For example, despite the fact that photolithography to reproduce image easily and completely without the need of transcribing them again by hand on stone, some image adopted by 电视在 assorted painting here from the original Ubra printed painting manuals actually was kind of hand copied first before being reproduced lithographically in the second edition of 电视在 painting manual. Because in the 电视在 painting manual, it actually adopted a lot of image from the Japanese painting manual. The one on your left is the original Japanese painting manual. But when you adopt it into the 电视在 painting manual, it could have been just do the photolithography. But what it did in the second edition is that it hand transcribed first to get this kind of softness of the movement of hand, and then do it and then use photolithography again. So apparently it was meant to liberate the stiffness on your left of this kind of carved line in the original Ubra printed image and pursue the soft and vivid traces of free handwriting on your right. Therefore, it may be said that 电视在 assorted painting show the use of technology to mimic the handmade, while Yinxiange assorted painting manual, on the other hand, sought to surpass the limit of man-made by technology. To start with, these 2 directions on your right and on your left are just only 2 different kinds of aesthetics and visual taste. However, it resulted in totally different reaction in the cultural context of the use of the traditional Chinese painting manual. Shen Dunhe, in his preface here, says that Ginkō miniaturized the famous works from his country into books to reward students and show them the canons. In other words, this publication was meant to be used as a kind of painting manual for learning. And Shen Dunhe also emphasized that these painting of landscapes, figures, flowers, and birds are all beautiful. Their forms are all well-shaped with observation of front and back, and they are well carved with clarified and refined details. Even ancient carvers could not achieve this state of delicacy. His highly praised copperplate usage as a kind of well-disciplined manner to achieve the standard of the heavenly made, and argue that pursuing craftsmanship is almost like pursuing Tao. Shen Dunhe, educated in Britain, appreciated in Yinxiange assorted painting the precision and craftsmanship shown in copperplate engraved images, and also the strong shadow effect, probably just like the Western print or paintings that he was familiar with in Europe. Interestingly, the other preface contributor, Wang Dao, who had a closer connection with traditional art circle, had a rather different attitude. He said that the brush is nevertheless good enough, But what made people linger over and over again is its intricate engraving. In other words, what is attractive is actually the craftsmanship of this refined carving, which actually has nothing to do with the commentary on painting. This is very different from what was asserted in the advertisement of this famous lithographic painting manual I just mentioned earlier, the drawing of famous artists in Shanghai, which emphasized that in addition to taking their print as a painting manual for copying, one could even use the printed leaf, mounted a screen, zero-shaped hanging scroll, or attach them on window or lamp as real painting. None are more clever. It is indeed one item with two functions. The image in these painting manuals apparently were meant as a kind of substitutes for real painting in every aspect, just like you can see that in a lot of interior depiction in 电视在重画 in the 电视在 pictorials. There are so many, images that maybe some of them are directly from this kind of lithographically printed image as, suggested by this advertisement. The characteristic of sharp and refined lines that the copperplate engraving is capable of, like this one, is especially suitable for making Western style map. That is why the copperplate map published by Ginkō in the late 19th century were highly treasured and were reprinted all the way into the 20th century. Meiji Japan versus late-Qing China, a kind of connected yet incommutable art history. Why did Ginkō insisted on applying copperplate printing to reproduce traditional Chinese painting? Did he not understand the obsessive pursuit of quality of brush stroke by Chinese artists since at least, the Yuan dynasty, the 13th century? Did he mean to bring the so-called Western style embodied by the rigid and machine-like copperplate printed line in transforming traditional Chinese painting? Or was he simply trying to naively duplicate Dian Shizai's success in his business of image reproduction with another printing technology? This is worth noting that despite the fact that Ginkō's befriended with many Shanghai traditional artists, and he himself was also a practitioner of traditional ink painting, like this one. These two paintings are done by Kishida Ginkō. He actually was a typical Meiji figure who truly admired the civilized West and believed in transforming Japan through Westernization. In most of his advertisement for his medicine, he is usually seen fashion in Western attire. You can see here. There's also an illustration drawn by himself in his personal journal commemorating his first Shanghai trip, entitled Mr. East, Dongyang Xiansheng, which show Ginkō himself like an English gentleman with a cane in a tailor coat working against Western style building. This self-image truly reflected his own identity as a new style figure in the age of reform. For Ginkō as a reformer, it was seldom mentioned that, yet quite significant, that he was closely associated with many early oil painting of the Meiji period, including Takahashi Yu-chih. You can see here, the one on your left, this is the sketch of the portrait of Ginkō, drawn by Takahashi Yu-chih. And also Goseda Yoshimatsu on your right, and Yamamoto Hosui on your left. Ginkō indeed was very important sponsor of oil painting circle in Meiji period. He joined the Meiji Fine Art Society, Meiji Bijutsukai, the first Western style painting association in Japan in 1889, and gave a talk for the monthly meeting of the society in 1892. In it, he argued that fine art, 笔句子, is an important indicator of how civilized are the people of a country and the representative art of Meiji period. He emphasized that the representative of the Meiji period should be the progressive form of oil painting. In contrast to his support of oil painting, he actually despised traditional Chinese ink painting at that time, even as he seemed to aggressively socialize with Shanghai artists. In a letter to his friend in Japan in 1880s, he not only revealed his contempt for Chinese painting by referring Chinese painting as Taro-like landscape painting in Chinese style, but also argued that no one in China have achieved excellence of the technique of oil painting. So Kishida Ginkō here actually mapped Japan's newly developed concept of quote-unquote painting after Meiji Reformation onto the situation in China. Therefore, for Ginkō, the pursuit of brushstroke was apparently no longer the only standard for the whole discipline of appreciating and evaluating artwork. In this context, was his insistence on using copperplate printing to create the texture of weaving kind of fastidious and precise line and endeavors seemingly beyond human capacity meant to progress Chinese painting from Meiji perspective? Is this the situation? Or we probably will never able to confirm Ginkō's true intention. What we know, however, is that despite the fact that his project combined the most prominent elites and technology in Sino-Japanese circles, it was neither successful or influential. In sum, copperplate printing failed in his competition with lithography in a market for examination books due to his unfavorable price. Following this defeat, Rakuzendō subsequently conducted a battle in the market of imagery reproduction, almost from the perspective of an outsider in the traditional art practices of China. After these two setbacks, Rakuzendō's copperplate business barely survived by printing Western-style maps. Therefore, the trade in copperplate books between China and Japan, as stated by the Osaka book trader Miki Sasuke, say, as according to him, only lasts from 1874 or 1875 to 1882. So that is a very short period of time. So in contrast to Major's seamless meditating by Western technique, Ginkō's copperplate business lost contact with the internal logic of the local situation and eventually failed. Given the Japanese cultural affiliation with China, which might have enabled Ginkō to achieve even more connection with many highly placed cultural elite, it did not find an appropriate gravitating point to fuse local needs with foreign techniques. So the tradition mediated was not recognizable or not recognized. In short, this is a story about Meiji Japan talking to late Imperial China in art, a parallel conversation that failed to result in action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lai. That's fantastic. There's so much for us to take in there, and now I'm very happy to say that we have some time to discuss this a bit further. Once again, I think we've got a lot of people in our audience who may have some of their own research interests intersecting here, so I'd invite the audience to pose some questions. And in lieu of those, to begin with, I think I might start with some myself, I thought it was very interesting the way that by the end of your talk, we began talking about copperplate printing, but we also, I think, ended up in a kind of conversation with oil painting as a technology as well. And so we can see that there's, these, how can we say, a kind of competing technologies of reproduction, and that in some ways the mechanical reproduction is not necessarily seen as just a a standard for technology or technical sort of excellence, but also a commercial kind of opportunity, but not necessarily something which loses out to oil painting. So that's something I thought was very interesting, and particularly because in my own work, it's also apparent that the Meiji government was a big sponsor of oil painting, more than popular, market kind of culture. So I mean, first of all, I'd be very interested to know if you've looked at the circulation of these painting manuals and their potential impact on artists in Shanghai at the time. For people who are perhaps less familiar, what kind of I'm wondering what's happening at the time. You mentioned with some of the contemporary Shanghai artists who are producing work for painting manuals in the 1880s. What was their relationship to this kind of printing industry or to printers such as Tianshizai? Can you talk a little bit about that? I think maybe people may be unfamiliar.
Thank you, Olivia. I think printing as a kind of industry, I may say that it's almost like a IT industry nowadays, that when you have iPhone 12 and you feel that there are new capacity you can see. I mean, it's hard to imagine the life nowadays without smartphone. And so I probably could say that lithography in the art circle at that time, probably just like a smartphone. I mean, before, the only way you can access to the painting or to buy a painting is only through the melting shop or by personal connection. So there's no way that you can really get a piece of the famous artist's fragment of drawing any kinds of things. But I mean, I think Ernest Major was very innovative in this aspect, that when he started the printing industry, I mean, using lithography, he immediately, almost at the same time, with his Shanghai newspaper, he opened a studio, the printing studio, specialized in using lithography to printing all kinds of things. But not only printing old books, he immediately recognized the potential of the art market. So at the very beginning, he used this lithography to reproduce old paintings. And so you can go to the shop, just as I showed you earlier, the Dianshizai shop, and to buy different kinds of reproduced painting and ask them to mount it as hanging scroll or hand scroll or even the Western style frame. So that is a totally new business. And he was not only kind of selling the reproduction of the old paintings, he immediately started to kind of collaborating with the artists, and Shanghai artists at that time. For example, the artists I was working on, that Ren Bonian or the Zheng Xun, all these Zheng families, and also Hu Gongshou, and they actually collaborated with this new technology in a very early stage. So it seems that this is really a hard to imagine, I mean, scenario that you suppose that is a very commercial, that is a very kind of conservative art circle, very traditional, but actually using this very kind of new and foreign technology. And the most exciting thing is that the most profitable market actually is not using new technology to do something new, but to use the new technology to facilitate the traditional need. So what make Ernest Major a fortune is not reproducing Western painting. It's not reproducing Western postcard or any kinds of something foreign. Actually, it's to reproducing things that Shanghai people were already familiar with. That is the traditional paintings. So that is the biggest markets there. So I think it's really something, yeah.
It's interesting because when you say that it's fulfilling a kind of traditional need, it brings to mind, of course, at this time there's a resurgence, and shortly after this time into the 20th century, early 20th century. Of course, that's a time of a lot of archaeology that's happening. There's digging, some of which is not entirely legitimate, of course. There's very contested history, but Shanghai artists are responding to that, you know, and these sorts of antiquarian tastes are coming up in their painting. And perhaps, you know, new wealth is being made in a city like Shanghai. So in some ways it's traditional, but it's also a new audience. Is that fair to say?
I think it's a kind of expanded audience, but in a traditional fashion. I think that is the reason I really like about late 19th century, because everything in late 19th century is kind of so hybrid, so mixed, and not so clear. But for example, in the 20th century, that in the early 20th century, a lot of things has changed dramatically. Now, China realized that the need to kind of modernize, to learn from West or learn from Japan. So now you started to have students study abroad, and so everything's become so apparent. But in the late 19th century, I mean, it's just so many different, I mean, elements there. But how you should use or adopt or reject there's no mainstream idea. So everyone just become very innovative, very creative about how to use the new things in their own way, on their own terms. And so, and in terms of the audience, I think there was really a new kind of expanded audience, that because now everyone can buy a piece of paintings. You can, if you see all this kind of interior design in the 电视在 pictorial, I mean, the contemporary interior, you will see there are so many images. I mean, it really kind of occupies the whole interior space.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
And the way that you point out that these are images of images, which of course is also a trope in some ink painting, but in the 电视在 and 电视在画报 and the work of people like Uyuru, it looks like a fashion magazine in many respects. Yes. It's like a picturing of a new kind of fashionable shared space in some ways. I hesitate to say public, but it feels like a kind of public. And you also made the point that this technology, and this one of the questions is pointing to this technology was known to the imperial court, but not introduced beyond the court. And so in some ways that seems to underline the public aspect of this new introduction in Shanghai. So I'll go to one of the questions here. The first question is asking, since copperplate prints had great success in exam books and maps, was this technique used more in non-artworks, so not for artistic reproduction, but for other forms of reproduction in Shanghai in the late 19th century? In some ways, this question, though, is encapsulated in the next question, so I might combine them. And the question says, you know, it's a wonderful presentation, especially the mention of Qianlong's court. So what's the relative balance between woodblock printing, copperplate printing, and lithography in China and Japan at this time? So two different times, I guess, we're talking about, my mistake. And isn't it noteworthy that at exactly the point that lithography enables the proliferation of cheap printing in Europe, there's, at this time, Europe is especially fascinated by Japanese prints, which of course were not seen as high art or particularly valuable originally in Japan itself in the form of ukiyo-e. Can you comment on those questions, on the relationship of these different printing technologies at that time?
Yes, I think that is an excellent question. I think one of my interests is to see, I mean, the nature of the technology or media itself actually has a lot to do with what the artist or the printer want to express. For example, I think copperplate engraving especially, and there's an afterwards story about copperplate engraving. For example, in the late-Qing period, it's almost the same time. I think it's 80, if I remember right, it's 1880s or 90s. There's a publisher using the copperplate engraving to reproduce the core edition of 西清古鉴. And so that 西清古鉴 actually originally in the court was not printed in copperplate. It was printed in Ubra printed in the Qianlong period. But now they have this new technology of copperplate engraving, which is very good at this kind of sharp line. And it's quite suitable for printing this kind of, Xi Qing Gu Jian basically is the depiction of vessels. And so, but not only for the function perspective, but also this kind of engraving has this kind of royal kind of aspect to them. So later, the court, some local government actually present the board, the copperplate board, to the court in the late-Qing period, because it's more like a retreat, kind of retrace the glory of the High Qing period. So this technology itself is not, when people perceive it, it's not only about the effect, the function, but also about the perception of the technology itself. Just like when you get an iPhone, it's not only about how good picture you can take from iPhone, but there's certain kind of connotation about class, the group, how kind of people you are. So the technology or engraving does have some kind of connotations that is beyond the function itself. Lithography, I think lithography later took over even the exam books business. I think it's purely because lithography can also print very small books, but not as good as, not as sharp as copperplate engraving, but it's good enough. But because it's just cheaper. So people, I mean, because for this kind of exam book is purely for very practical use. So the cheaper, the better. So, so for that purpose, that copperplate engraving just could not compete with the lithography. Yeah.
Is that the same case in Japan? So one aspect of this question compared the situation of printing or the types of printing technologies in China and Japan. In my own work, I've been very interested in collotype printing, which of course is the kind of slightly later period for the most part. But I know that in Japan, collotype continued, and even now, it continues for some art publishing, but it continued much later when it had already become too expensive, I believe, or impractical elsewhere. What's the story for copperplate printing, particularly as it relates to reproduction of artwork in Japan? Does that have a similar trajectory to China, or are there different needs? Or
I think this is a very important and very interesting question, because from the observation, the trajectory was quite different. For example, this is the late 19th century was the beginning of the journalism and also newspaper, the modern newspaper in both Shanghai and also Japan. But so one of the marketing strategy, I think, is probably inspired by the London illustration or something, London's newspaper, all give you this free insert. As a kind of marketing or promotion. If you buy the newspaper or you buy the weekly or something magazine, you will have the free pictures. But for the 电视斋 studio, at the very, very beginning, a major higher contemporary Shanghai artists to make the painting or drawing and reproduce them directly in lithography. But for the Japanese part, I mean, they actually use woodblock print and hire the ukiyo-e artisan to do the part. So it's more like the huge group of ukiyo-e industry kind of make its own transformation toward a new age by attaching or working for the newspaper industry. But in China, it seems that we didn't see the woodblock covers that working for the newspaper, but there's this kind of new kind of media and new technology kind of filter into this kind of new business model. So I don't know whether this is because of the Ernest Major's personal decision and innovation or the different attitude toward new media at that time in China and in Japan. I don't know, but they actually started in very, very different way.
I have another question, and I know we're kind of running nearly short on time, but you mentioned Ren Bo-nian, who's just such a fascinating artist, and I think it's a very interesting example of an artist who was very influenced by all sorts of prints, in, you know, even in his younger years, and had access to, you know, publishing. And so I'm kind of curious to know more, and I guess to introduce to the audience as well, this relationship between new images and the reproduction of images, and how that may have influenced some artists, and in particular, because you're so familiar with Ren Bo-nian's work, what kind of examples could you give of how this printing technology was impacting an artist such as Ren Bo-nian, who now, of course, looks very traditional, but was kind of like a crazy contemporary artist at the time?
Thank you. I mean, this is actually the focus of my dissertation almost 20 years ago. And I mean, it's quite interesting because all of a sudden you have this new technology with camera. So it's basically photo lithography. You combine camera with lithography. So basically you can produce any kind of image in a very, very unprecedented fashion and very quick. And so this is, you can imagine that was a booming industry. And then all kinds of the painting manuals, the books with image published at that time was in great quantity that was unprecedented. So one of the issue would be, you can see that call for books all the time in the advertisement of Shenbao newspaper, that asking people to contribute that anything that can be reproduced. So in that situation, Ernest Major actually collected a lot of Japanese books and Japanese image, including, for example, the most famous ukiyo-e artist, Hokusai. So some of the Hokusai's image were adopted and transformed and put into the second edition of the assorted painting manual I just mentioned. And interestingly, that what kind of image that Ernest Major selected from Hokusai's image database, he actually, or the editor of the assorted painting manual, actually choose Hokusai's image with some kind of Chinese origin or Chinese kind of home. And then with this new technology, you can modify the image very easily. So just take off the over-decorated part and transform it into a Chinese image. But the thing is that even it looks like Chinese and on the Chinese, and also about Chinese subjects, but this kind of flavors still are distinctive Hokusai. And so I think it's this kind of exotic, semi-Chinese, but semi-Japanese thing that Ren Bo-nian actually adopted a lot. So, and created a kind of new kind of visual sensation that has never seen before in Chinese art, because you see this kind of very dramatic composition, you know, ukiyo-e paintings that we are familiar with, that is very unique Japanese. But after even being transformed into a kind of disguise themselves as a kind of Chinese image, this kind of dramatic visual effect was still there. And I think that was the thing that influenced Rinpoche's art most. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really interesting to think of kind of an acceptable sort of modernization of a particular picture culture or style. I'm going to have to leave it there. We've got a number of comments rather than questions. Just thanking you for your very informative presentation and conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you to our audience who've joined us today. This talk will be available online, which is great. And I'd like to thank Dr. Yu-chih again for joining us from Taipei. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. And it was a great experience to talking to you all. Okay, bye-bye.